Before coming to York, Rukmini was a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for the History of Emotions at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development. Rukmini also happens to be from my alma mater in Delhi School of Economics and Sociology before that. Rukmini's work examines questions, her research questions are at the intersection of urban politics, labor and emotions with a focus on both colonial and post-colonial India, and today's work she's presenting that. Her first monograph, published in 2022 by Cambridge University Press, is called In the Shadow of the Mill, Workers' Neighborhoods in Ahmedabad, 1920 to 2000s. The book analyzes urban change through the prism of everyday political practice and property relations in the Indian industrial city of Ahmedabad. I'm not sure if you're going to talk about a new work, but she's working on a new book project with a historical ethnography of working class intimacy, conjugality, and domesticity in 20th and 21st century India. She has a long list of publications. Her research has appeared in the International Labour and Working Class History, and a German one which I can't pronounce, and a recent edited volume on Feelings and Work in Modern History, Emotional Labour and Emotions about Labour. And I'm very grateful for Professor Raju Das to come on board as a discussant. Many of us don't need introduction to Raju. Raju has been a long-time colleague in the Department of Geography in the Faculty of Environment and Urban Change. Raju's work focuses on the relations between politics and economics, both theoretically and in the context of geographical context of India. He writes about class relations, nature of capitalism, the state, poverty, uneven economic development, and the nature of neoliberal agriculture and industrialization, fascistic tendencies, and progressive social movements, mostly in India, I think, right? And he has a long list of publications, and some of his recent work include critical reflections on economics and politics in India, a class theory perspective, and the political economy of New India. Thank you so much, Raju, for coming on board. And with that, I would invite Rukmini to take the stage. So, if you haven't seen it, I can just pass them along.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. It's really lovely to be here and to present my work. And I guess what I'm presenting today is really at the intersection of my, historical ethnography of Ahmedabad and Ahmedabad's working class neighborhoods, and my, new project on emotions with a focus on the working classes. So this kind of brings the two together. And so my presentation today is really a part of a larger project that tries to initiate a conversation between labor history and the history of emotions. And part of this is really animated by an interest in questioning the idea of emotions as something, ahistorical and universal, and also to explore its sort of analytical purchase in examining working class experience in sort of everyday textures of life, in richer and more nuanced ways, specifically by paying attention to the ways in which feelings are historically shaped and are socially embedded. So I want to focus on three things in my talk today. So first, to think about deindustrialization beyond this kind of uniform narrative of loss and resignation. Second, to think about and consider how a set of emotional practices were produced by dominant forms of trade unionism in the Western Indian city of Ahmedabad, of which you have a pretty stylized map here. And third, to look at categories such as harmony, to think of both its political significance, but also its tensions and what it might potentially conceal. So this is really about the later half of the 20th century, starting in the 1980s, which marked the beginnings of a really debilitating process of industrial restructuring that shaped working lives in Ahmedabad. This was, of course, part of a broader movement of deindustrialization that unfolded across India. And deindustrialization in 20th century India has followed a somewhat divergent trajectory from similar phenomena globally, right? So instead of marking a transition to a sort of so-called post-industrial society, deindustrialization in India precipitated the displacement of workers from, large, often formal sector factories or workplaces to informal, poorly paid and precarious work arrangements. So this did not so much mean, capital flight to other locations with cheaper reserves of labor, but rather it implied a dislocation of sites of industrial production and a very pervasive restructuring of employment regimes. Recent scholarship on deindustrialization has shifted from a focus on its sort of political and economic causes to a consideration of its social and cultural meanings. So within this framework, deindustrialization is viewed as a dynamic sort of emotional and affective process that shapes memory and animates notions of class and community. And I really draw on this body of scholarship by placing emotions quite center stage in my examination of Ahmedabad's process of deindustrialization. So, and what this kind of approach allows me to do is to trace in some ways the heterogeneity of experiences of workers facing and navigating industrial restructuring and casualization, and it does complicate this often uniform narrative of loss that dominates, accounts of deindustrialization. So in doing so, I consider the history of deindustrialization as an ongoing process rather than as a discrete event. So to use Alice Ma's term, a kind of process of industrial ruination. And to do this, I outlined the kind of wide and very variegated spectrum of feelings that are tied to the changing dynamics of work. So in this, I do make an attempt to kind of trace the interactions between structural transformations and individual subjectivities, and also address the sort of social, political, and spatial underpinnings of the feelings and emotions that kind of emerge with this process of deindustrialization. So just to give you a sense of what Ahmedabad is like and its industrial landscape, so from 1861, when the first textile mill was established in Ahmedabad, the city acquired a reputation as the Manchester of the East. So mill chimneys and workers' neighborhood kind of bloomed in a crescent, and you see the shaded light blue section along the eastern banks of the river Sabarmati. At its peak, there were 63 composite textile mills operating, employing roughly, over 150,000 workers daily. Ahmedabad's mill workers, though they were living and working in distinctly trying conditions, were amongst India's best paid industrial workers. The 1980s, however, marked a period of social and economic upheaval in Ahmedabad, along with these large-scale mill closures, which resulted in over, more than 100,000 workers losing their jobs. The city also witnessed long periods of caste and religious violence. The responses to deindustrialization in Ahmedabad appeared to be quite dramatically different from those, say, for example, in Bombay or Mumbai, which was undergoing an acute period of industrial crisis at roughly around the same time. So while textile mill workers in Bombay banded together for an 18-month-long strike against factory closures, even in opposition to the stand taken by their representative trade union, militant collective action in Ahmedabad was missing. And in fact, contemporary observers of this period saw the workers of Ahmedabad as docile. So in order to understand this representation of Ahmedabad's workers and the sort of connected emotional registers that emerged, we must begin by examining the dominant, if not really hegemonic, conceptualization of working class politics in the city. So the industrial belt of the city, again, this, the shaded blue area, had long been the stronghold of the Gandhian labor union, the Textile Labour Association, or the TLA, and its political ally, the Indian National Congress. So the story of Ahmedabad's mills and those who worked in them were inextricably tied to the story of the city's main trade union. And to grasp the emotional dynamics of deindustrialization, it is really to the TLA that we must first turn. So the TLA, or the Textile Labour Association, was born of Gandhi's first political fast in 1918, and it established pretty early on, by the early 20s, at the forefront of the labor struggle. And this is a move that other scholars have also pointed out was something that was quite actively encouraged by industrialists. So this union established a model of arbitration and negotiation between labor and capital that has partly contributed to the image of Ahmedabad's working classes as peaceful or even passive. And this model of arbitration had an impact far beyond that of the city's textile industry. It formed the basis of a national level, Industrial Relations Act, which was kind of brought into existence by Gulzarilal Nanda, who was a TLA General Secretary. So the militancy, the union did emerge out of certain moments of militancy, was gradually replaced through the 1920s and 30s by an unwavering commitment to arbitration. And this commitment did not sway even during the sort of deepest moments of crisis of the textile industry. So the union cast mill workers as members of a parivar, or a family, which encompassed the owners, managers, and workers, and it sought to instill obedience and docility by emphasizing, duties towards employers and a reciprocal responsibility of the management towards the workers. So it really operated through this logic of trusteeship in a way. But this language of kinship, because the family, metaphor was used quite liberally and powerfully, it worked to kind of imbricate the control of workers' lives and spaces with a sort of filial duty. And emotions were clearly implicit in the union's view of industrial relations, which were geared towards harmony between labor and capital, and encouraged this kind of collaborative, peaceful, and righteous. And righteous is really a term that emerges quite clearly within union discourse, a righteous approach to industrial disputes. So strikes were to be used as an absolute last resort when all peaceful and constitutional methods of negotiations had been exhausted. Even when on strike, which was exceedingly rare under the TLA, workers were enjoined to be peaceful and non-violent and to bear no ill will towards their employer or managers. So the union was convinced that a harmonious atmosphere in the mills would not only encourage higher productivity and enable the workers to render sort of valuable service, but which would also make the experience of working itself lighter and more pleasant. So the intertwined logics of emotionality and productive efficiency in this case produced specific forms of workers' subjectivities that would support the needs of capital. So as part of its righteous struggle, much of the union's efforts were directed towards material, moral, and social uplift of textile workers. And this was aided in no small measure by the TLA's really prodigious political presence. So from 1924 onwards, the union began participating in electoral politics, and it contributed large numbers of representatives to the municipal bodies right up to the 1960s, when their electoral presence started kind of tapering off. So with these kinds of connections in the political field and in civic administration, and armed with a really well-oiled network of neighborhood level union representatives, the TLA embarked on its goal of all-around progress. So just to give you a sense of what, just to kind of like visually represent what the TLA was trying to do. So these are mill neighborhoods from the 20s, and this is from the 50s. So this is the kind of change, I guess, they were envisioning. This is for later. Anyway, so they wanted this kind of sense of all-round progress, and they negotiated for the provision of civic amenities. They mediated everyday conflicts between landlords and mill worker tenants. They appealed for better housing, ran libraries, dispensaries, gymnasiums. So in short, as other scholarship has also pointed out, the union operated a sort of parallel government in the mill neighborhoods. And through such a presence in the working class neighborhood and its role as the sort of sole representative union, the TLA retained a really strong hold over the textile workers, despite several challenges to its authority. So, as part of its efforts towards the material improvement of workers' lives, the TLA carried out its social reformist agenda of remaking Ahmedabad's workers into responsible and respectable citizens. So, and central to this civilizing mission, in some ways, was a focus on developing a specific emotional repertoire for the working classes that spanned across, that was not located only on the shop floor or in the factory, but that kind of connected the worlds of the home and work. So it emphasized non-violence, restraint, moral virtue, temperance, prudence, and thrift, and all of this with an aim, clearly stated aim towards building worker self-respect and dignity. So while the TLA's own repertoire and occasionally a lot of nostalgic accounts of the past tend to render the textile workers as a unified body, divisions of course did exist and were in fact reinforced by the union's very mode of functioning. So I just want to take a brief detour here to kind of outline the composition of the workforce in order to sort of contextualize what follows. So work in the textile mills was historically segregated by caste and religion, with each department drawing labor from particular groups. So for instance, many Dalit subcastes were employed primarily in the spinning departments, communities such as the Bagris in the frame departments, upper caste workers in bundling and reeling at like the higher ends of the labor process. Weaving sheds were mainly staffed by Muslim workers, with a gradual increase over the years of middle castes, such as Patels. And among others, Marathas and Kolis also formed, a fair proportion of the workforce. So while there were changes to this kind of caste-based occupational groupings in the textile mills, much of this earlier segmentation persists and in fact was strengthened by the fact that the TLA structure was as a federation of various departmental unions, and by its very mode of organizing, by which different departments were really quite insular in their union activity as well. So the bulk of the union's membership was composed of Dalit workers, while often the better paid Muslim weavers remained historically somewhat distant from the union, often moving towards communist or more militant labor activism, especially peaking in the 1950s and 60s. And this constellation, of course, of caste, community, and often regional ties also resulted in somewhat heterogeneous workers' settlements, right? So workers lived in poorly serviced, what are called chawls, but these forms of, industrial housing that emerged mainly in large part in many industrial cities. And for the better part of the 20th century, Dalits and Muslims, the two groups in very broad categories that dominated mill work in Ahmedabad, lived in very close proximity. Now, women workers had also formed a considerable portion of the workforce in the early decades of the 20th century. So they, comprised about 15% of workers in the 1920s and had been whittled down to less than 3% by the late 70s, early 80s. And the TLA also actively encouraged women to withdraw from wage labor and supported the rationalization or the retrenchment of women workers by promoting an ideology of feminine domesticity that called for women to emotionally and materially sustain the home. So many of the women workers who were retrenched in these rationalization drives of the 1930s and 60s, of course, returned to the mills as contract workers or substitute workers. So my point being that at no point was the workforce an entirely secure formal one. Nearly half of the workers by the 1970s were non-permanent workers who labored under meager protections. Nevertheless, I think a distinction does need to be made that there was an overarching security that was offered by the textile mills that distinguished mill work from other forms of casual labor, and mainly because it effectively guaranteed work almost every day. So despite the fact that that mill work wasn't necessarily a solidly secure and not precarious form of labor, when the mill closures did happen through the 1980s, it came as a shock, even though the textile industry had been kind of sputtering for a few years. And indications of impending closures were signaled first when the third shift in the mills were discontinued, vacancies were no longer filled, and then gradually entire departments began to be shut down. So between 1980 and the 1990s, the composite textile mill industry was dismantled almost entirely. But however, as the closures sort of unfolded, anxieties and uncertainties were more finely graded, right? Like with the possibility of certain mills reopening, certain segments of the workforce being more secure, and certain skills more valued. So the issue of staggered layoffs, because none of this was happening in one go, introduced another layer of tension. So substitute and contract workers were often the first to be dismissed, followed by those working in the third shift. So with the very survival of the composite mill in doubt, additional pressures were placed upon the work process and production units. So contemporary news accounts from this period suggest that while spinning departments remained reasonably profitable, the costs incurred by weaving departments were partly responsible for the textile crisis. So some mill owners at this point indicated that mills could be reopened if the weaving departments were scrapped. Some, for instance, retained only the spinning departments, liquidated their weaving, processing, and other units. So the sort of differential anxieties and apprehensions were generated by one's place in the hierarchy of work, and they were often articulated at this point in the idiom of caste and religion. The Muslim workforce in the textile mills had been gradually shrinking, and the weaving departments were being increasingly staffed by middle caste workers. And Muslim mill workers clearly linked in their narratives from this period, clearly linked community identity to occupational vulnerability as they negotiated the sort of ruptures that were created by the mill's closing. Similarly, Dalit workers also recognized stigmatization and discrimination and increasing sort of occupational and work-based precarity as stemming from their caste position. So despite the Textile Labour Association's public posturing of intra-caste unity, forms of untouchability persisted historically in the establishment of separate drinking water facilities and rest spaces, among others. Technological changes that sort of impacted the spinning departments in particular affected both Dalit workers and women workers more deeply. So the tensions over industrial restructuring and shrinking mill employment expressed in terms of community indicated deepening schisms between various groups of mill workers, and such concerns really tied together questions of work segmentation experience of systemic prejudice, and the sense of discrimination that often marked working lives. Simultaneously, because this is, like there is this sense of, the Ahmedabad's workers being so passive and docile, there was, of course, a pervasive sense of anger and betrayal that surfaced against the TLA. The union had retreated from taking any kind of militant stand and concerned itself with appealing to principles of trusteeship. So, social activist Manishi Jani's contemporaneous fact-finding report on retrenchment, which included a series of interviews that were conducted with former mill workers, commented on the union's attitude during this period. So, and I quote, "They believe the textile industry is one big family. The mill owner is the head of the family while the worker is the younger brother. And that is why the worker must request the family head with folded hands. And if he's not satisfied, he should seek help from Sarkar Mai Baap." So referencing the union's well-established emotional repertoire of harmony, such commentaries foregrounded the practices of supplication and paternalism that marked the TLA's relationship with both the state and with capital. So the union at this point, and I am quoting from various oral sources, was deaf and dumb, busy trying to persuade the workers not to wash dirty linen in public by getting excited and angry. So the union stand was perceived by retrenched workers as suggesting that they remain peaceful and starve, and reinforcing widely held assumptions that the workers of Gujarat are mild-mannered, peace-loving, and not struggle-minded. So the TLA really did appear as the weak point that the workers were dealing with. So emotions, or more precisely, the appropriate way of feeling in the face of extreme economic crisis, emerged as the site on which workers and the union were pitted against each other. And indeed, more recent work has pointed out that militancy was one of the grounds on which right-wing labor mobilization has occurred in Gujarat. So the disillusionment with the TLA's response was exacerbated again by rumors circulating around the union's complicity in the closures. Workers' concerns about impending mill closures were dismissed by the union. So the union did not just take a merely passive position in the face of mass retrenchment, but was actively involved in the corruption and the sort of deal-making that surrounded mill closures. And these the workers' feelings of discontent were not just directed towards the union, but were also aimed at broader institutional structures that they had so far been part of. And it was under these circumstances that there were several dramatic and public acts of protests that were led by new unions that had been formed under the Sangh Parivar umbrella. These protests, one of which included a sort of masked suicide attempt, aimed at calling attention to workers' suffering and hardship, and aimed to articulate it in a really visible and public form. So this was an occasion for the BJP, newly formed at that point, to signal that they were listening. So Ashok Bhatt, who was one of the architects of the Gujarat Ahmedabad's BJP outfit, who orchestrated one of these protests, responded to Congress party leaders who dismissed the incident as a political stunt, that this will sound like a joke to all insensitive people, but for those whose kitchen fires are dead, this may mean many things. So the anger, resentment, and the sense of betrayal that former mill workers felt towards the union is perceptible even in present-day conversations about the past. So it was less of trade unionism and more of brokering deals, as Jignesh Bhai, one of a former mill worker, told me. But after the mills closed down, I quote, "Did workers die or did they become completely destitute? No, this didn't happen. We all went into different lines of work. Some got jobs in power looms and workshops, others started hawking or began petty trades like running phone booths and so on." So this shift towards informal employment, or the fall from paradise, as Jan Bremen in his magisterial work on Ahmedabad puts it, was accompanied by profound emotional upheavals. These neighborhoods became dull, and this is a word in English that was said to me. They became dull once the mills closed. Amrit Bhai, who's a former mill worker, recalled that kind of mahal, or the atmosphere ambience, was lost forever. The mahal that Amrit Bhai was referring to was one that is remembered as brimming with vitality, oriented by the rhythms of the mills, and framed by bonds of sociality and conviviality between mill workers. The mill sirens, which were often likened to a mother's call to come home, governed everyday life, structuring domestic chores and meal timings, and directing the bustle of large groups of workers on foot or on cycles as they moved from their chawls to the mills. So the loss of this mahal was really felt as a sensory one. So, and as you know, and this also had repercussions across generations. So for older male workers, deindustrialization signaled an enduring trauma. It was articulated as an embodied loss. I did not know how to live, where to go, and what to do. It was like losing my hands, as one narrative points out. They spoke of closures in the language of bereavement, as if somebody had died in the family, in terms of a shock, like a parent's death, or as a form of intimate grief, of feeling like becoming a widower. Having to then find employment in unskilled or otherwise poorly paid jobs, sometimes even doing the exact same work that they did in the mills, was perceived as shameful. Female work participation increased during this period, and while women workers were considered to be more resilient in weathering the crisis of deindustrialization, there was a shift towards work that had been previously considered humiliating or degrading. So in other contexts, scholarship on deindustrialization has shown that unemployment produced a crisis of masculinity and a loss of male pride. Now, Jignesh Bhai told me now every member, with the stress on the every member of the household has to work, and even then, this household will not be able to afford, jaggery or ghee or seasonal vegetables. Jignesh Bhai's conversation betrays a nostalgia towards the past that is fairly common amongst older residents of the mill neighborhoods in particular. So in such recollections of life at the peak of the textile industry, the trope of the male breadwinner that Jignesh Bhai recalled was seen as a measure of a good life. So although women in the mill neighborhoods had historically been involved in waged work throughout, often in home-based, casual or contract work, there was a transformation in the dynamics of work following the mill closures. And the fiction of feminine domesticity and the sole male earner thus punctured unsettled notions of masculinity in this social milieu. So deindustrialization not only transformed employment regimes but also unsettled a way of life. The network of institutions that was largely mediated by the TLA, for example, access to credit, dispensaries, reading rooms, and all sorts of other sorts of institutional things were disintegrated. As workers turned to lower paying, more precarious jobs, there was a collective drop in the standard of living, which also had generational repercussions. So along with higher salaries in the textile mills, as Jignesh Bhai recounted, there used to be a lot of support for scholarships and so on, and mill workers' children benefited from this. So earlier with education, you could see the birth of a new middle class, and now this kind of upward mobility has become very difficult for the working classes. So this new middle class that Jignesh Bhai referred to was an entire generation of Dalit workers who acquired economic prosperity through stable mill employment and affirmative action, and often resulting in their physical relocation from the cramped quarters of the mill districts to the suburbs. So even workers like Jignesh Bhai, who had never been made permanent in the mills, felt this loss of possibility and connected it to diminishing sort of social status more broadly. So his concerns are not so much a sentimentalized longing for the past, but rather it's a lament of the loss of possibilities, of opportunities, and a vision of the future that was conceivable in the past. The emotional attachment that especially older generations of workers retained with the materiality of the mills was visible decades after the closures. Mill identity cards were safely stored away inside trunks and cupboards and brought out, with much ceremony to show to researchers like me. As our curfew passes, which allowed mill workers mobility during intermittent periods of violence. So the mill compounds, whether they are desolate, wait, let me show you a picture of desolate. Whether they are desolate or rejuvenated, which is something like this, these are housing complexes. They remain part of the emotional geography of these neighborhoods. So Jivan Bhai, who is another former TLA representative and a worker in Saharanpur Mill Number 2, would etch out the contours of his spinning department onto the flattened, empty landscape, actually, as he recalled his work life. Other workers would conjure mill gates out of thin air as they outlined their daily commute to the mills. So this sense of place is one that is clearly grounded in the historical experiences of work and its everyday rhythms. Yet there were other ways in which the workers related to the spaces of the closed mills. The mill structures and the boundary walls were gradually dismantled as local residents combed through the mill compounds to forage bricks, scrap iron, anything really that could be used or sold. So the material remnants of the mills thus found their way into workers' everyday lives, into their housing, and formed a kind of tenuous safety net during the harshest period of the crisis. There was, again, a very fraught process of compensation. The textile mills had declared bankruptcy, and many of the mill lands were caught between competing claims, and the TLA, which was still like the primary, the sole mediator in all of these negotiations, was routinely accused of corruption. However, as compensation started trickling in, one of the first investments that former mill workers made was in housing. So against the backdrop of declining standards of living and this loss of social prestige that had followed the mill closures, new material practices kind of emerged, which can be read as carrying really profound emotional significance. So workers could, for the first time, afford to renovate their chawls. So on the foundations of the original low-roofed structures, 2 or sometimes 3 stories were added, walls were cemented, floors were tiled, and gradually other markers of relative affluence were added, attached toilets and bathrooms, a television, a fridge. So workers who had lost the social and institutional support afforded by employment in the mills had, as Jignesh Bhai put it, something to show for it. So the process of deindustrialization and the emotions that were embedded in it were not necessarily consistent, but rather they gave rise to spatially and really temporally contingent feelings of ambivalence. And coeval, as this is happening, as the mill industry is collapsing, there were tremendous changes unfolding in the political realm. The TLA's electoral presence had diminished considerably, and its political ally, the Congress Party, was also rapidly losing its grip on municipal politics first. And in the meantime, the nascent, Hindu nationalist Bharatiya Janata Party stepped up efforts to broaden its initial upper caste, middle class constituency. So in the wake of the caste violence of the mid-1980s, the BJP embarked on a nationwide effort to kind of embrace lower caste Hindus into a greater Hindu fold. BJP-affiliated trade unions proliferated across the state as the party aimed to reach the urban poor. And once the BJP entered the Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation in 1987, party officials opened local offices in the mill neighborhoods. So in this way, the party penetrated existing areas of urban sociality, the street life of the mill areas, the addas, historically forged and finessed by the TLA and its representatives. And at these, while the TLA was sort of embedded in this form of public life through its vast network of worker representatives, the BJP's initial mode of functioning relied really on an engagement of senior party members with local youth. So there was a new channel of proximate intimacy that was inaugurated, which offered closeness to political leadership and to state agencies. Beginning with widely established techniques of gaining neighborhood support, organizing health camps, distributing school supplies, the party moved on to incorporating young Dalit men into lower rungs of its leadership. So at a time when the first shock of the mill closures had sent industrial districts into a crisis of all sorts of livelihood, social identity, reputation, and status, this move could be seen as one that offered a space in which young working class men could make an attempt to reclaim some autonomy and a degree of social status and standing. So the BJP's presence and success in the mill neighborhoods of Ahmedabad knitted together a range of sometimes complementary and sometimes contradictory sentiments. So these included specifically local and classed feelings of isolation from networks of political power and visibility, resentment as a form of perceived injustice against the TLA, and this feeling of being useless. And at the same time, of course, as many of you know, it also drew on national level emotive strategies of being and feeling part of a unified Hindu body. And again, as I'm sure many of you are familiar, Ahmedabad has acquired this reputation of being one of post-independent India's most riot-prone cities. So major episodes, and there are many others, but the major episodes of religious and caste violence occurred in 1969, throughout the 1980s, intermittently again through the 1990s, and especially during the pogrom of 2002. And much of the scholarship on Ahmedabad and violence in Ahmedabad tends to view the collapse of the textile industry and the TLA's decline in particular as a crucial factor in the communalization of the city's politics. So, for instance, scholars like Ashutosh Varshne contend that organizations like the TLA constituted some kind of bulwark of peace and were instrumental in establishing, civic contact between different communities. So the disintegration of the city's formerly harmonious social fabric can be dated to the collapse of the textile industry. Jan Bremen, again, a very influential scholar on the city, suggests that the TLA diffused communal tensions by appealing to working class solidarity. So this form of social consciousness, which rested on communal harmony, was in this view, was replaced by an attachment to primordial loyalties, which emerged with the decline of the mills. Endemic urban violence, again, as understood by another very influential thinker on the city, Howard Spodek, sees it in part as a consequence of criminalization that surfaced once civic order, fostered by institutions like the Textile Labour Association, kind of start eroding once the mills close. So violence had an effect on the breakdown of institutional and moral cohesion. So it is not my intention at all to suggest that deindustrialization did not precipitate profound transformations with really far-reaching social, political, and emotional consequences. In fact, much of what I've said has argued that new emotional register kind of emerged to articulate this kind of changed relationship with work and with trade unionism, but it's rather to prize open this category of harmony, which seems to color so much of how the past is seen. So what does it really mean to say that mill workers were a more harmonious lot in the past, or that the TLA promoted social harmony? So at one level, the narrative of harmony doesn't just appear in scholarly accounts of the city, but also in popular memory of the mill neighborhoods in contemporary Ahmedabad. An anthropologist, Rukmini, has written how she witnessed an almost tangible desperation to believe in and represent a once peaceful past that had progressively decayed. And I noticed a similar tendency during my own conversations with former mill workers. So this memory of the mixed neighborhood and forms of intercommunal camaraderie surface time and time again, and it can be counterposed with the more starkly segregated living arrangements of the present. So this image of the past that linked together work in the mills with feelings of neighborliness, implying that a shared work culture translated into social warmth and cohesion outside of the mills. So these narratives of an idealized sort of working class community certainly elide both the social divisions that existed, the drudgery and the hardship of work in the mills, but they of course offer a very powerful counterpoint to talk about and also to critique socio-political dynamics of contemporary Ahmedabad, which are undeniably grim. But even in these nostalgic accounts of harmony, we can find traces of other more ambivalent and contradictory feelings. So one crucial way in which harmony is conceptualized in this city is related to intercommunity support and mutual protection, and the narrative goes that this was really bolstered by the labor union during periods of violence. So this understanding of harmony often implies that the violence came from elsewhere, that the perpetrators were outsiders. So people like Jeevan Bhai, who was a former mill worker and also a TLA representative, his recollections of the violence of 1969 kind of complicate this. So Jeevan Bhai was, not only was he a former a TLA representative, he was also a municipal councillor for the, and he built his entire political career on the plank of communal harmony. So during the riots of 1969, when there were months of unrest and curfew, Jeevan Bhai recalled that he would slip through the warren of streets behind his chawl and make straight for Saranpur Mill number 2, which is where he worked. So workers at each shift would move together 50 to 100 people at a time. And those who lived amongst their own community, he told me, managed to get to work. So while violence in the neighborhood shaped very much how and when workers were able to make their way to the mills, there was, in many of these accounts, there seemed to be very little conflict within the shop floor, right? This is something that I've also encountered elsewhere, namely amongst, Jan Bremen's interlocutors and a published recollection by a former mill worker. So these accounts often relate peace within the mill to feelings of brotherhood. Jeevan Bhai, on the other hand, sees it as a function of distance, that their mill departments and our departments were separate. And he also presents an entirely different profile of the perpetrators. So these were local strongmen who were often his friends and fellow TLA representatives who cleared out, and again, like this is said with some bravado, entire neighborhoods of Muslim mill workers. And in 1969, when the violence happened, this was the first beginnings of a sort of communally charged spatial segregation that began in Ahmedabad. So I think there is often a slippage in the ways in which we think about the operations of the trade union or the TLA in these accounts that posit the union as a keeper of social cohesion and harmony. So in other words, accounts that suggest that the TLA's emotional repertoire that emphasized non-violence and harmony was not contested. So the TLA's extensive sort of apparatus of grassroots control was often buttressed by precisely the kind of unruly worker that it was publicly committed to sanitizing. So while the union urged the male workforce to be non-violent and respectable and prudent. Its actual operations on the ground depended on those who embodied fearlessness, aggression, the ability to inflict violence and to inspire respect. So the TLA was not, as as one can imagine, an institution that was separate from the textures of everyday life in the workers' neighborhoods. But if this was so, then the argument that harmony was something that the union fostered and disharmony or violence something external to it doesn't really hold. So indeed, in Jivan Bhai's recollections of the past, it is these feelings that are associated with a virile, aggressive and clearly and openly bigoted masculinity and the sort of social bonds that come with it that he highlights. So just to conclude, I want to just reiterate that this broad range of feelings that I've kind of outlined that followed the closure of the mills, that ideas or feelings of loss, betrayal, and despair were really framed by communally segmented structures of the work process. These feelings had a spatial location and a very deeply sensory dimension. And life in the mill neighborhoods that followed deindustrialization reconfigured many of these emotional practices by combining working class anxieties with Hindu nationalist militancy. So deindustrialization did not just manifest in emotions of loss and resignation, but in also rather complex and often troubling registers of feelings, right? So in sort of re-evaluating this nostalgic rendering of a harmonious past in the light of recurrent religious and community-based conflict, I suggest that harmony and its other or unity and disunity were really enmeshed even in the glory days of mill work. And as Ahmedabad remakes itself as India's first heritage city, there have been renewed efforts to preserve its industrial past. So mobilizing nostalgia to memorialize and really to aestheticize the city and its mills, I think runs the risk of erasing the kinds of violence and dispossession that has marked the city's 20th century history. So that's it. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Rukmini, for this really rich and provocative, interesting paper. And now we have love to see the written version. But yes, do you want to answer? And before we open the floor, we have some time.
Yeah.
And you can also take the question as you stand there. I don't have to. Do we mind? This is generating a lot of heat. Is it possible to turn this off?
Turn it off.
Nari, can you turn this off so that cooler without save some energy? Anyway, you can.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you, Raju, for such a close and generous reading. You have raised so many questions, some of which I hope I will be able to answer. Let me start with your, question about from the political and economic aspects to the cultural and social. Like, I try to work against or without this kind of binary formulation, and this is probably what you sensed, because then this seems like two very distinct bodies of work and distinct kinds of positions that are not really speaking to each other. But what and you're absolutely right that there certainly is emotion everywhere, and emotions have been a central part. I mean, it's a part of both collective and individual life, and that's no surprise. But my intention really was to see it more as a set of processes, and I thought this focus on what is affective and what is emotional allows one a view into a more, I want to use a word that Patricia actually used last time, a kind of cellular view into working class lives. So you're absolutely right, and I take that comment very well, that this kind of division is arbitrary and is probably is not helpful, but that I do think analytically the focus on what is affective and emotions has not really been foregrounded. They're in the subtext, they're often in the footnotes, they're there as uninvestigated sort of set of feelings, right? And they exist kind of uninterrogated in some ways. And that was really my intention, to also think that emotions are also not one thing, and also that they have a history and a politics to it. You know, just the issue of anger that you brought up is definitely both historically and socially contingent, and it's embedded within certain kinds of broader structures, let's say. Which kind of brings me back to your first question about like what is emotions and what it can be distinguished from. And here again, I would like to kind of think of emotions not as something distinct or opposed to rationality. And I think that that kind of distinction often leads us to privilege certain kinds of action, certain kinds of behavior over others, but rather to think of how emotions and rational thought, or rather emotions and cognition, are shaping each other, and that it is an iterative and interactive process. And it's also that, I mean, again, to kind of connect to your question of personal and political emotions, that this is not just something that is interior. It's not, I mean, it is of course an individual, I mean, emotions are quite literally located within an individual, and it is felt, through the body, expressed in words. The body is really an agent in some ways of emotions, but at the same time, they are really shaped socially, culturally, historically. So this, idea of emotions as being something internal and interior and therefore unreachable in some ways for scholarly investigation is something that I'm trying to move away from, and also to think of how emotions are really connected to forms of thought and forms of cognition, and also other structures that kind of shape sets of emotional practices or repertoires, whatever we might call them, which can be more social or collective. And then your questions about like why did the mills close? I mean, the mills closed, but it's not that there was a real financial loss in many cases for the mill owners, right? Many of the mill owners kind of, I mean, at the same time, as many of you know, this was a period of widespread sort of informalization with the opening of industrial estates, with the opening of power looms. So a lot of, investments were kind of funneled towards those kinds of processes, and at the same time there were like the mill lands, which were, I mean, some of them are caught under all sorts of litigation, but some of them have great real estate value. So there was also this kind of drive towards land and property as a source of investment, and where money was really being funneled towards. About like why did no militant action take place? I mean, there were individual, so that's the thing. There were smaller protests, there were, hunger strikes, there were different ways of, adapting to this, but there was never a sense of collective militant action. And partly it was really because the TLA was the only representative union, and that kind of militancy and also, like all other unions, especially in Ahmedabad, had been dismantled through the 60s. And I mean, there were very actually quite powerful Congress Socialist and Communist unions. There were also, the Dalit Panthers who were very active in the mill neighborhoods. But all of these had been gradually chipped away, really by the sort of everyday apparatus of the textile the TLA, and much of this had to do not just with their position as the representative union, but really because of their involvement in municipal politics. So it was just as a way of like thinking about how working lives were clearly not just focused on the workplace, but obviously people lived in those houses and in those neighborhoods, and the TLA representatives were really the people who could allow them to have a certain standard of life, just in terms of the sort of civic processes that were possible at that time. So yeah, but these are wonderful provocations and questions, and thank you very much.
I think the floor is open, so Rukmini, if you have questions, queries, whatever, go for it.
Patricia, yeah.
Well, I wanted to follow up on your comment and your engagement about the relationship between the political economy and cultural and social, and your reference to the idea of cellular, and I'm talking very much like a geographer when I say, is this a question of scale, the kind of from to? But not only as the way that geographers think about it, but in terms of like the way you've just been talking about a kind of agency and the way that emotions and that really complex intersection between personal and sociological and kind of back and forth, but the way in which they're actors in the production of history and how this outcomes, so they're these larger forces. Is that a question of scale? And in which case, how do you knit them together for talking about history?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It is a question of scale, because we're talking about, at a very fundamental level, when we're talking about emotions, we are talking about individuals. And not just individuals, we can also break it down to certain, gestures and, forms of embodiment, or, certain kinds of physical responses. So we are talking about individuals, which can be seen as one scalar unit. But that, the reason why I think emotions or affect could be particularly productive is because within that emotion, through that, the scale of, or the unit of the individual is kind of shot through with all of these other social and structural forces. So I think the way that I would see it, and the way that is most, makes most sense for me to work, is to see the individual really as constituted by all of these various factors, and that is where all this knitting could possibly happen.
Yeah. I was struck by your emphasis on the neighborhood as well, and and that geographic space that seemed to contain most of the lives you were talking about, rather than the city, even though the city is also its own important context there too.
Yeah, so so again, starting with the individual, this really is a work, scale is really important in thinking about this, because one can think of the individual as really as constituted by all of these forces, of course, and as the sort of node in which many of these, threads kind of come together. But that, the individual, of course, is also located within a wider web of socio-spatial relationships. And there, thank you for bringing in the neighborhood, because the neighborhood is really central, I think, in many of these analyses of, especially of working class life, because they are, on the one hand, they can be seen as really having a particular set of daily rhythms, and especially with the mills, they were a very standardized set of daily rhythms. And then again, thinking of the neighborhood as as a sort of stigmatized space, right? Especially in sort of legalistic or public policy narratives about working class lives, and this kind of transition from what was once an industrial district to what is now a slum, I think is also could be a critical way of kind of working in the scale of the neighborhood as again connected to broader political and economic and urban planning processes. Thank you. Yeah, Shreyashi.
I have a question. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. So you touched a fair bit on religion in your analysis. I was just wondering if your work shows, or if you can give me an idea of if ever a religion and religious emotions were used as a tool to manufacture conforming, compliant workers. So was it because you spoke about different religious groups existing. So I'm just wondering if your work gives any kind of indication as to if religious emotions were ever mobilized, to make people do certain things which they wouldn't otherwise do.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think the clearest example would be, the formation of the Textile Labour Association, which was deeply, Gandhian, and therefore also mobilized a lot of, sort of Gandhian religious rhetoric around the ways in which, like the ideal worker was thought of, what forms of behavior they must practice. And that set of issues that emerged with the formation of the union. But again, I don't want to speak too much on this, but of course, like with religion being such a such a contentious and political mode of mobilizing, there have of course been in recent years where religion is used to create different kinds of, again, working class subjectivities, but that are very clearly in the sort of communitarian mode, right? So yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this. So many questions. I don't know much about the literature, but this is just so much to think about. And in response, what you said was what became quite, apparent and interesting is that how this is a register which we don't normally tap into when we think about industrial labor, working class politics. This is the question of emotion that you said is kind of embedded, hidden, and it comes out in particular classed, gendered ways. So I think your invocation of this emotional geography, I thought was just brilliant. What I was particularly taken up by the way in which the idea of harmony and has played out in so many ways through the 20th century India, and in the face of the backdrop of disharmony which has pervaded. So there's a kind of a dialectic which Raju is referring to. There's a constant contradiction that harmony is being invoked. My question is actually, and this speaks to my perhaps not knowing enough about this, that you mentioned that Ahmedabad, a particular city, Gandhi's city, a particular kind of anti-British mobilization, and which is kind of comes out as a docile duty to be harmonious and ensure productivity, versus Bombay, which has a very different history of workers' movement and fairly militant, I would say, and TLA being a particular kind of articulation of that. I was wondering, what this docility, could you link it to Gandhian strategies? Is it, what happened to other movements? What is the way in which, why Bombay Bombay mill workers or unions had a different politics? Because it was those are strike-ridden landscape for decades, whereas Ahmedabad was a different landscape and different emotional geography. So I was thinking, what do you attribute this docility or the notion of duty and harmony to?
It's absolutely, because it was two things. Of course, Gandhi was very, very influential in the setting up of the union. The union was also first founded by Ansuya Sarabhai, who's the sister of one of the most prominent mill owners of the time, and the sort of, and Ahmedabad's history, especially in the early 20th century, was very much connected to, between mill owners who were often from sort of traditionally powerful communities, and also had a lot of like marital and kinship relations amongst each other, but who were also very important and prominent in civic politics. So there is a whole sort of enmeshing of different of the same people across different sort of situations or nodes of power. And this idea of docility was really, I do relate it very much to early Gandhian principles of nonviolence and of cultivating a certain kind of ethos that the working class was meant to embody as this, as at the forefront of Indian labor mobilization. But to come back to think about your question on strikes, it's not as if strikes didn't happen. There were many lightning strikes, especially during the interwar period, which was a pretty volatile period anyway, across industrial cities. But there again, like TLA did work as strike breakers. Again, in the 1960s, there was a really powerful movement that kind of connected a lot of anti-TLA, and it was a sort of ragtag band of dissenting unions, but it became very powerful, and they did have like a massive strike. But again, it was the TLA that really actively kind of started breaking down their organizational basis. And part of the reason why they could do it and they were so successful is because of how embedded they were in the neighborhoods. And because where in Bombay, especially, the neighborhood was really seen as a site of workers' mobilization, right? Like as where like other unions could kind of exist in outside of the workplace. But in Ahmedabad, like the two spheres were so deeply connected and connected mainly through the question of urban belonging and the kind of claims they could have on the city, where the route for most of the 20th century was through the union.
Interesting.
Michelle?
I love this. This is a really fun project. I'm really excited. And I really like, looking forward to reading the book, but I really like the way you historicize emotion, and you talk about it as iterative, but changing over time in these ways, but also show us how the production of emotion is so operative, it's so powerful in these spaces. So then it made me think with this, I guess, two sides of questions. Like, if this feeling and experience of harmony, or this ideal of harmony, it seems it's operating both at the affective level within people and how they relate to each other, but also perhaps at a discursive level or maybe it's intentionally used at certain moments. So part of me wondered that when the right-wing unions come in, how do they respond to a sense, either to a past sense of harmony or an idea of harmony, or do they do so explicitly, or do they respond to a sense of nostalgia, right? Like, are either of those things becoming operative in this space? And then, is there explicit work within the TLA on, you say they're explicit moral projects of the TLA. Are they explicit affective, emotional projects too? Like, is there any internal reflection that this is what they're doing as they're putting it together? With the Gandhian history of it, it would seem like serious possibility for that kind of reflection happening as they're doing it.
With the right-wing unions, I have to say, did not, like, they were, it was a whole range of unions that kind of emerged through the 1980s, and they range from, I mean, many of them may not have been trade unions, many of them were, say, things like slum dwellers associations and, projects that basically targeted the urban poor. For the right wing, I would think, and the sort of more institutionalized right-wing trade unions are more dominant in other areas of Gujarat, not so much in Ahmedabad, and they never had a real presence while the textile industry was really at its peak, right? Like they just emerged towards the sort of towards the end, and they kind of connected issues of dispossession and state neglect, and in this way, like of course, like it was a kind of paradoxical project, but one that really spoke in the language of community or of religion, right? Like, so it was never about a sense of working class solidarity in any way, but when they're mobilizing these sentiments, it's really very much about nostalgia. It's about thinking about like the glorious past and a glorious past that is really hollow in some ways, right? It's emptied out of a lot of different people who were part of this past. And sorry, I've forgotten your second question. Yeah.
So
the
earlier on
the
with the TLA,
yeah.
Was there any intentional reflection on the affective aspect of their project?
Internal, I wouldn't know. I don't know if there would have been internal reflections, but there were self-consciously, if you mean it like that, there were self-consciously emotional projects, and especially those that were directed towards women workers, right? So, and a lot of these, very sort of public, both discursive as well as, which also had a kind of very clear material dimension, were kind of targeted at the working class neighborhood and at the home as a kind of material space, right? So, which first of all, it required women to be laid off, which is what like the TLA was actually actively advocating for, even though most of these women were part of the union itself. But there was this whole masculinization of the trade union movement, which is again not something specific to Ahmedabad, but as the trade union movement in India kind of gained strength, it also did become more masculine in a sort of institutionalized sense. But in Ahmedabad, and as the TLA is kind of directing women workers to behave in a certain way, there are very explicit sort of instructions in very practical ways on how to be a good working class wife, right? Like, and where it is like gender is both, and a gender subjectivity is created that is both classed and made respectable for this kind of ideal male worker, right? Like, because again, all of these projects kind of begin with this dictate that what does the happy worker long for? I mean, this is the this is often like the kind of preface to many of their publications. He wants a stable job, he wants a happy home, he wants good food on the table, and then it follows like how to do all of these things and what are the sort of, everyday practices which require both a sort of not training, but like a production of a certain kind of person, a gendered person, and a production of a certain kind of emotional style to be able to support this. And I think that like if we were to think of it like even more expansively, it included practices like housekeeping, thrift and budgeting, planning meals, taking care of, like making sure that children are not in the mills, because that was another, even though Ahmedabad did have one of the more sort of social welfareist industrial spaces with, hospitals and creches and things, but But of course, there was always this kind of representation of the working woman as someone who was negligent and careless, and that is what they were really clearly trying to reshape.
Okay, I think, until what time do we have the room?
So we have it till 4:30.
Okay, good, perfect. Go ahead.
You mentioned briefly in your presentation that children would get scholarships also. So I was wondering, in the publications that that were generated for wives and family members,
Yeah.
was there any specific publication targeted towards children, like how to orient them to become better middle class workers in
Yeah.
future?
Yeah.
In my mind, I'm thinking of this small piece that Lalit Wachani wrote in Caravan about the use of comics
Yeah.
in RSS.
Yeah.
And I was also thinking about how like Amar Chitra Katha started on this notion
Yeah,
of
yeah.
what emotions to suppress
Yes.
towards the longer
Yeah.
goal of rationalizing unification.
Yeah.
So I think just that, like, were children part of that audience?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, absolutely. Children were definitely part of this. They were running schools. They were, in fact, I mean, and in this way, like, let us also, I mean, the TLA did have a very vibrant sort of neighborhood infrastructure in place, right? But all of them did kind of create a certain kind of worker. So the TLA had, you know, like they ran hostels, they ran schools. They also had, you know, like, you know, in their publications, there would be, you know, there'd be competitions and drawing competitions and, you know, things on Gandhi Jayanti or things on around Independence Day, all of which are modes of training people how to feel a certain way, right? So, and for girls, they again had, like, you know, so this was also, education was also obviously gendered. So they had a different set of skills that they were kind of promoting and training them in, you know, the usual, like sewing was one which I did, yeah. Yes.
Thank you so much for that rich work. I'm also really looking forward to reading your book now. I was wondering, this is such a fascinating, like the Labour Association and Ahmedabad, such a fascinating, also a locus where Gandhian politics and Hindu nationalist politics come together, and both Muslim and Dalit laborers are envisioned to be important players in the long-term politics, and how it pinned out, especially like based off of your work. Do you think what can we learn about this interaction if we could think of it, and if maybe it's not a fair question, but could we think of it as a microcosm, and are there any lessons to be learned about this interaction in India?
Well, I mean, that's a really loaded question because, like, Ahmedabad has been seen by others as really like a shock city for India, you know, as kind of foreshadowing many of the things that have happened nationally. So I don't know what exactly we could learn from this, but I do think it foretells, and it kind of, it is a kind of experimental space in some ways of you know, processes and things that could at some point be more national. But that reminds me, I think Raju asked me about, like, you know, like what are the modes of labor organizing, or, you know, that could come out of this like in practical terms, like what emotions could do. And I think there, I find a lot of the work of Black feminists to be really powerful. The idea of love and care as something that has a political meaning, and that can, you know, create spaces of solidarity. So yeah, like a focus on emotions. I mean, like anger, of course, is a really powerful way of critique. But that anger also needs to be, I think, like located within a larger framework, perhaps of care, and that can lead to better possibilities than we have at the moment. So,
On that hopeful note, thank you so much,
No,
this
the
is,
wonderful questions. This is really lovely.
We made you work very hard. Thank you very much. Thank you. But please help yourself. You have some very light refreshments, and look forward to. Yes, we have to take pictures. We can all stand together. We have. Please do return for our next round of talk by Mona Pan, which will be on Kashmir.